Oh, it's about all those three things. The flag is the Star-Spangled Banner. The flag that led to the composition of the poem that became our national anthem really was a particular object. And this is about that flag. It's about the poem that was inspired by that flag, and about our national anthem, and the man who wrote the poem that became the national anthem. All that in one book. Oh, I think it's a good story. I hope it's well told. I didn't get the idea. Up until very recently, I was a reporter at the New York Times. The last 21 years in the Washington Bureau. And among my assignments over the years has been the Smithsonian Institution. And I wrote several pieces about the effort to restore the flag that's pictured on the cover of that book at the Smithsonian. And the last time I did a piece, it was in 1999, it was given a very big splash in our science section. Corey Dean, the science editor, liked the piece and ran a lot of pictures with it, and it caught the eye of an editor at Dutton, a man named Doug Grad. And he called me up the next day, and he said, I think there's a book in this story. And I said, I'm your man, but I'll check with the New York Times first, because it's a New York Times story. I did the story as a New York Times reporter, and they said, fine, do it. And so I did it. Well, which story do you mean? There's a lot of them. That was the biggest discovery that I made. Obviously, it's not a discovery to serious historians of the subject, but the reason that the British burned Washington was because it was in retaliation for the Americans burning what is today Toronto. It was then called York. It was the principal city in British Canada. And the commander of the British forces in the Western Hemisphere gave instructions to his forces that as soon as they could, they should do the same thing to Washington that the Americans did to York. I didn't know that the Americans had even invaded Canada, let alone burned down their capital. A lot of people thought that Canada was a good candidate to be one of our states. A lot of people thought that that would be one way of keeping the British off balance, is to attack them before the British could attack the United States. It was never a very good possibility that the United States could conquer Canada, but there were a lot of people who thought that it would be good. For one thing, not too many years before that, the United States in the Jefferson administration had engaged in the Louisiana Purchase. And a lot of that territory would be naturally in the South, and they would be slave states. Some anti-slavery people in the North thought that if they could annex parts of Canada, these would become northern states. They would be anti-slavery states, and that could balance against any new slave states that came into the Union. Oh, just a few thousand, perhaps. They were led by, among others, General Pike, for whom Pike's Peak is named. General Pike had the misfortune of being killed in the battle there. The building that held the explosives, the dynamite or the black powder, the weapons of the British blew up. They don't know whether it was blown up because of a stray shot, got lucky from the Americans, or whether the British blew it up to keep it from falling into the hands of the Americans. But it did blow up, and 30 or 40 Americans were killed, including General Pike. Carl Benn is the historian for the city of Toronto. He's a marvelous man, and he was good enough to read over that chapter for me, to cast his critical eye on it. And I asked him, why is it that Americans don't know anything about the American attack on Canada? And he said that's one of the most interesting things he finds in Canada. They ask people what they've learned after tourists come and visit the historic sites in Toronto. And he said 80% of them said, I didn't know the United States attacked Canada. And if you walk out on the street here today, on North Capitol Street, you'll find nobody knows this. Maybe after they read the book, everybody will know. I don't know. I wrote that down because he said it, and I thought it was a very good and strong point of view. I don't know if that's so. We know well, the Japanese are certainly not a Western culture, but there is a dispute that's been going on since the end of World War II. The Japanese history books will not acknowledge the rape of Nanking. They will not acknowledge the use of comfort women in Korea. The French, I don't know what the French textbooks say, but I would be very surprised if the French were not more chauvinistic than Americans. Yes, he was against war. He was a pious man, at least by his contemporaries' descriptions of him. And he didn't join up until the British were actually in Chesapeake Bay. So he put off for a long time going to war. He was against going to war with Britain. But he did sign up with the militia, and he did participate as a young officer in a principal battle here outside of Washington called the Battle of Bladensburg. The British, on their way to Washington, defeated an American Army unit in Bladensburg, and you're a resident of this area. You've probably driven through Bladensburg many times and not been aware that something important happened there. I certainly was not aware of it. It is a major battle. Scott Sheeds, the historian at Fort McHenry, which is where most of the activity for the Star-Spangled Banner occurs, Scott said that Bladensburg was a very important battle, and he wishes that Americans knew more about it. It was on the road to Washington. The British were going to punish the United States for the burning of Toronto, and when they got to Bladensburg, the Americans were waiting for them, and the British force was clearly superior and put them to a rout. James Madison, who was then the president, was actually there and was witness to this. He had an assistant, a free black man, and he sent his assistant to the White House, which wasn't called the White House then, but we'll call it the White House. It didn't have his coat of white paint yet. He sent this man to the White House to tell his wife, Dolly Madison, to pack up and clear out because the Americans were being routed, and he didn't want Dolly to get caught by the British. It would be a pretty embarrassing circumstance. The Americans were overconfident. They probably didn't have very good intelligence as to how big the British force was, and they thought they would, I mean, how are you going to capture? First of all, his Secretary of the Army, Secretary of War, said that Washington would not be a target. So don't worry about fortifying Washington. Well, he was fired soon thereafter. So the Americans were overconfident. And as you say, the table at the White House was set for dinner for 40 people, and the wine had been brought up from the cellar. And it was consumed, but it wasn't consumed by Americans, it was consumed by the British. Everybody said yes, and they did it. Everybody there, all the British knew that that was what they were going to do. He got in there, and there was nobody there. Everybody fled. The city of Washington was not prepared. They thought there was no real reason for the British to attack Washington. There was no strategic importance. Washington had only been the capital for, at that point, 12 or 13 or 14 years. There was a Navy Yard in what is now southeast Washington. There were all of the buildings of government, but there was really no strategic reason. They didn't realize the propaganda value of one country capturing the capital of another country. I don't know exactly how many soldiers were involved. It was not a lot because as the United States went into war, it did not have a large army. Teddy Roosevelt, writing in 1882, blamed Madison and Jefferson for getting involved in a war with the world's greatest power and not having anything to back it up. Roosevelt was, of course, a leading Republican of that day, and we think of him today as a leading Republican. Jefferson and Madison were members of the party that evolved into the Democratic Party today. So you have a case of a Republican political leader criticizing the Democrats for not being well prepared militarily. And it's the same thing that has happened in the 20th century. I remember when Ronald Reagan was running for president against Jimmy Carter, one of the big things he said was that Carter had let the armed forces run down. Teddy Roosevelt said that about Jefferson and Madison. The war gets us to the point of writing the anthem. After the British burned Washington, their next target was Baltimore, which was a more important target. Baltimore, Americans don't think of Baltimore now as a major city, but in the 1810 census, it was the third largest city in the United States. It was important for shipbuilding, it was important for commerce. The privateers that sailed out into the Atlantic Ocean to attack British shipping, most of them were made in Baltimore. So Baltimore was a larger military target. And the only way that the British could capture Baltimore would be by sea, by coming up the Chesapeake Bay and up the Patapsco River, because they didn't have a large enough land force to march from Washington to Baltimore. If they had had enough in their armed force, in their army as opposed to their Navy forces, they could have marched from Washington to Baltimore and captured Baltimore. And who knows what might have happened then for the course of the war. But they didn't. And in fact, most of the army that Britain sent to North America, they sent to Canada. If they had sent those people to the Washington area, to Philadelphia, they could have captured, who knows, they could have captured most cities on the coast. So they didn't have enough land forces to go the 30 or 40 miles from Washington to Baltimore. So they had to sail down the Potomac into the Chesapeake, up the Chesapeake to the Patapsco, and attack Baltimore. But they couldn't capture Baltimore without going on land. They had to attack it. They had to attack Fort McHenry, which is sitting in Baltimore Harbor. And that is where the flag was. That is where the flag was that Francis Scott Key saw. Francis Scott Key saw that flag after the Great Battle of Baltimore, and that's what inspired him to write down his poem, which became the Star-Spangled Banner. He called it at first the Defense of Fort McHenry, but the next day by the next day it was changed to the Star-Spangled Banner. It became an immediate hit. Everybody was talking about it in Baltimore. Word of it spread all over the United States, and it soon became very popular. The poem, but it was sung. When Francis Scott Key was sitting on a little boat in Baltimore Harbor while all of this attack was going on, he had in his mind a popular song of the day. It was called the Anacreontic Song, or To Anacreon in Heaven. It has two titles. It's an English drinking song. And Americans of the day wrote parodies based on that song. So Key had this song in his mind when he sat down or stood and wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. Every word in his song exactly matches the notes in the English drinking song. Something like that, yes. Well, they couldn't bring them all over. In the beginning, they could only send a few over because they still had Napoleon to deal with. After they defeated Napoleon, then they could take all those assets and start bringing over more. So the defeat of Napoleon was very bad news for the Americans. He was in charge of, he was Napoleon's babysitter. He was one of the people earlier in the American campaign. Can you imagine watching over Napoleon? He was put in charge of an island in the South Atlantic, in the middle of nowhere, and his main duty was to make sure that Napoleon didn't get loose again, because, as you know, he was once held in Elba, and he was able to get back to France and do mischief. 34 years. Well, I don't know if this program is broadcast later on. We're taping this now in July. I am working as a summer editor at the International Herald Tribune in Paris. I took early retirement in April from the New York Times after 34 years. And our plan, my wife Iris and I plan to live in Paris for 4 months each year We hope to spend a month in Italy every year, and then 7 months back in Washington each year. And I will be a contract writer for the New York Times for the period that we're in Washington. So I am looking forward to a very active, early semi-retirement. I've been a newspaper man all of my working life. I was at Newsday on Long Island immediately before going to the New York Times. And before Newsday, I was at a newspaper in Trenton, New Jersey called the Trentonian. And before that, I was a copy boy at the Philadelphia Inquirer from about age 18. So I've done nothing else except newspaper work. So you're kind of limited in the number of questions you can ask about my professional career unless you want to talk about the newspaper business. I grew up in Camden, New Jersey. I went to Camden High School in Camden, went to Temple University in Philadelphia. I don't know. Like many people in journalism, I didn't set out to become a reporter or an editor. It happened. I got a job as a copy boy at the Inquirer, and that paid for my education at Temple University. I worked my way through school. That's also where I met my wife. So that's a pretty important couple of things that I got out of journalism. A lot of my colleagues never set out to become newspaper people. A lot of them did, obviously. They went to journalism school, but I didn't. And I've never regretted being a newspaper reporter or an editor. And it's been very enjoyable and very fruitful. And I've enjoyed it. It's my second book, I should say second and a half. I wrote a book about 15 years ago on mail order catalogs, of all things. The half book that I wrote, I ghost wrote a book for a celebrity who then neglected to give me credit for it. Well, let's not say. She said she forgot. Yeah, well, my wife knows. My kids know. I got a flat fee for doing it, and I was able to pay for our first vacation abroad from the proceeds of that book. So it was not a complete loss. Paris and Italy. I'm sort of nonplussed. What is there not to like? I mean, the food is wonderful. Paris is beautiful. Italy is beautiful. And I still love Washington. I can see doing this for many years. To have all of these things, have the possibility of working at the Herald Tribune for 4 months each year and having free time to explore Paris. I don't know if you had it, but you had, your network had Adam Gopnik's book on, and he writes charmingly about Paris. I would never write about Paris because I can't imagine spending enough time there. I could write about Italy. I hope to write about Italy sometime. It's old world, it's great food, it's great wine. There's lots wrong with it, obviously. They don't do plumbing very well, especially in Paris. You a smile of recognition there. The clocker. That's a guy named Zimmerman at Sports Illustrated. Yes. Among the things I've done for the New York Times is cover sports. And I was in Robert F. Kennedy Stadium a couple of years ago for a Redskins game. And they were playing the Star Spangled Banner, the Redskins band was. And I was in the third row, and I became aware that there was somebody about 2 rows down yelling, "Faster, faster!" And I had no idea who he was yelling to or who he wanted to do something faster. One of the other reporters told me that this was Zimmerman and that he clocks the playing of the Star Spangled Banner for every sporting event that he goes to. And his goal is to break the record. He wants the Star Spangled Banner to come in at under 51 seconds. And he'll yell. Of course, they can't hear him. There's 40 or 50,000 people there. There's a band, and he's way up there, but he's yelling for them to go faster. Yes, that's one of those figures where You make it more precise to give it an air of verisimilitude. It's got to stop one. I don't remember who the shortest singing was. The shortest performance was John Kiley, the organist at Fenway Park for many years. I think Kiley came in fastest. Plenty of people have come in slowest. It's unnecessary. The networks have recognized that it's unnecessary because for the entire season, when the Star Spangled Banner is performed, the networks go and sell beer or telephones or cars or tires or whatever they sell. So the networks have recognized it and have voted with their buttons that it's not necessary. Why is it unnecessary? There was one man I found, he said, Macy's doesn't play the Star Spangled Banner every morning when it opens for business. To me, it's an artificial form of patriotism. We don't need to have 50,000 people listen to a band, and Zimmerman probably is on the right track there. But our patriotism is a lot deeper than listening to a performance at a stadium. It's like these car dealers with their American flags on Washington's birthday. We're having a sale. We were in Paris for, I think it was Ascension Day, but it may have been Pentecost Day. Holidays that do not get a lot of recognition in this country, but in a Roman Catholic country like France, it's a big holiday. There's a big holidays. And my wife Iris said, "Isn't this interesting? In the United States, a holiday would be a cause for Macy's sales and things like that. But in France, and I imagine in the other countries in Southern Europe like Italy and Spain, the people actually take the day off and they don't go to work. And we do it just the opposite in this country. And I feel the same way, I think, about using patriotism for commercial gain like that. That's right, I'd forgotten about that. If I had remembered that, I would have put it in the book. No, of course not. I think if you use it for really important events, then it becomes more meaningful. It's not meaningful if when they play it at 162 baseball games. And the players, they tell the players, be careful where you scratch yourself, because they're sitting there waiting for it, standing there waiting for it to be over. They've got all these people watching them. You got to be careful what you do. And nobody's paying much attention. In Baltimore they pay attention because there's a line when they all yell "oh" at the same time. And I'm told that in Atlanta, in the line, the home of the brave, they make it the home of the Braves. Got it? So they do pay attention there. They don't pay attention most other places. People are out getting beer, hot dogs, and I think it loses a lot. They play it at the opening night of the opera. Well, they play it opening night. That's all right. They played it opening day of the baseball season. That would be all right. And for the World Series and for the All-Star game the other day, which I missed, for some reason that was not big news in France. Cal Ripken hit a home run. There was not a line about it in the French papers. The flag that we're speaking of for the original American flag was not done by Betsy Ross, if this is your subtle way of indirection. When I mentioned that I was from Camden, New Jersey, usually people arch their eyebrows when I say Camden, New Jersey. You're one of the first people who hasn't. Camden is across the river from Philadelphia. And when I was a boy, my father took me to the historic sites many times, to Independence Hall. And he took me many times to Betsy Ross's house. So it never occurred to me to question that Betsy Ross didn't do the first flag. She didn't do the first flag. There's no evidence that Betsy Ross ever made a flag. The first mention of it was by a descendant of hers many years after she was dead. But it's a story that caught on. I think we like legends, not just our society. It's easier to identify with a legend. Rome was founded by Romulus and Remus. That's a good legend. Betsy Ross made the flag. No, absolutely no evidence that she did. From her grandson. Her grandson wrote in the mid-19th century that his grandmother was commissioned by George Washington to make the first American flag. Absolutely no evidence that that ever happened. He would bask in the reflected glory of his grandmother. How he got that notion, I don't know. I did enough research into that one paragraph to be able to say with some confidence that Betsy Ross didn't make the first flag, but there's a bridge between New Jersey and Philadelphia called the Betsy Ross Bridge. So if you tell a good enough story, you'll get a bridge named after you. Yes, this is one of our heroes. She actually did make a flag. Now, it wasn't at the Revolutionary period, which is what Betsy Ross is associated with. She is the one who sewed that flag that's on the cover of the book. The picture was taken in 1873, so it was in black and white. The publisher took a little bit of a liberty to make the cover more colorful by putting in the red stripes and the blue field. But that's the flag that Mary Pickersgill sewed in Baltimore in August of 1814 so that it would be able to be flown at Fort McHenry, because the commander at Fort McHenry wanted the biggest flag he could get, and he would show to the British because he knew an attack was coming. So he could show to the British that the Americans were still there and that they were not going to be able to defeat him and his fort, and they would not be able to capture Baltimore. And he was right. It was a little bit of arrogance on his part. He wanted the biggest flag he could get, and he got it. I have no idea. It's one of those things that we've lived with for so long, I've never even thought to ask about it. We do know that there were 13 stripes for the original colonies, and the original flag had 13 stars. But why somebody thought stars and stripes would make a good combination, I have no idea. It was obviously an inspired choice, because this flag, the American flag, stands out so much. Maybe it's because our nation has been so successful that it stands out, but there's something about that combination. If you look at the flag on the cover there, it had 15 stars and 15 stripes, because by that time, there were more than 13 states in the country. There were actually 18 at the time of the War of 1812, but Congress had halted the practice of adding a star and a stripe for every new state at that point. And about 7 years later, Congress got into the habit of adding a star every time a state joined the Union. And we're old enough to remember Hawaii and Alaska. But they went back to the original 13 stripes. Can you imagine if we had a flag with 50 stripes? It would look like pinstripes. It wouldn't have the majesty that it has. There is a great amount of concern that if they don't do something, if they don't arrest its deterioration, that it'll fade away. It'll disintegrate. And because of its iconic status as the flag that inspired our national anthem, they've been able to get enough commercial support, donors, to pay for what will wind up to be a fair amount of money. We're talking about tens of millions of dollars. They have to clean it. In the early 20th century, it was mounted on a linen backing. And for all the years that we saw it at the Smithsonian, it was displayed vertically. The flag really should be horizontal, but it's displayed vertically. And we only saw one side of it. The other side was covered by this linen backing and millions, hundreds of thousands of stitches, an enormous number. Who knows? This may be like the number of times that somebody has clocked the Star Spangled Banner. It's one of those numbers hard to count. So many of those, the stitches are linen. The flag, the stripes, are wool. The blue field is wool. The stars are cotton. The dye on linen fades at a different rate than the dye on wool. So over the years, imperceptibly, the dye on the linen threads faded, and a gauze-like effect developed that you wouldn't know from looking at it. The researchers said that when they removed all of that, the linen threads, the colors came more alive. They could see them without this haze of all of those little pieces of linen thread in the way. They don't know. One of the things they have to decide is what to do. A flag has two sides. We've only seen that one side for all these years. They have to decide how they're going to display it. Now, they may have decided something since the book came out and since I've been in Paris. That's quite possible. Somebody mentioned something about reading something in the Washington Post, but as I mentioned to you before we started, I practically just got off the plane, so I'm not really up to speed on what's been happening with the flag in the 2 months since I've been gone. Well, that's a good question. What are our priorities? I'd spend it because of the symbolism, because of what it represents. It was a turning point in our history. I wouldn't go so far as to say that if Baltimore were lost, America would have lost the War of 1812. Certainly Americans would be learning more about it today. Americans don't know anything about the War of 1812. The war, the most important battle of the war, was fought after the war ended. The Americans and the British were negotiating in Ghent, Ghent is in Belgium today. In 1814, 15, it was part of the Dutch nation. After a lot of negotiation, the war was ended. Everybody agreed the war was over. So word came over on ship, and while word was coming over that the war was over, the British attacked New Orleans, which was one of their big mistakes. Not only it was a mistake because it was after the war was over, they didn't know. It was a terrible outcome. The British lost, I don't have the figure in front of me, something on the order of 1,600 men dead, and the Americans lost 12, something like that. The Americans were led by Andrew Jackson, which helped his career, obviously. Andrew Jackson had an army that was made up of local people from Louisiana, Army people, Navy people, and a contingent of free blacks. And Theodore Roosevelt, who I mentioned earlier, had a really keen observation on the use of free black soldiers, because the British ended slavery around 1806. The United States, of course, was slavery at that point and up until the Civil War. Here was a large contingent of free blacks defending New Orleans, defending a way of life that was keeping people of their race in slavery. Roosevelt, writing in 1882, found a great deal of irony in that, and I can understand why. I enjoyed very much reading Teddy Roosevelt's views of the War of 1812. Francis Scott Key owned slaves, and he was a member of the Colonization Society. This was an organization of people who wanted to free the slaves, but not to let them remain as American citizens, but to resettle them in Africa, in what is today Liberia, completely losing track. It was a racist thing. It completely loses track of the fact that most of these black slaves were not from Africa. They were born in the United States. And this colonization society wanted to remove them from the United States, have them resettled, have them settled, not resettled, have them settled in Liberia. The capital of Liberia is Monrovia, named after the president who succeeded Madison. So a fair number of blacks did get their freedom and were able to go to Liberia. I imagine if you tell a black person, a slave, well, you can stay as a slave, or we'll let you go to Liberia. Well, most people, I think, if given that choice, would go to Liberia. But the slaves should have been released. We had to fight a whole civil war. That's a whole different subject. So Francis Scott Key wrote in the Star-Spangled Banner that this is the land of the free and the home of the brave, the land of the free, and he had slaves. You know, and I've watched your program over the last few years when you did the presidents. Just tick them off on your fingers. George Washington had slaves. Adams did not. Jefferson had slaves. Madison had slaves. Monroe had slaves. John Quincy Adams did not. Jackson did. I know that some people will say, this is 2001, we can't judge those people by our standards today, but I think, to my mind, it's inescapable. Jefferson said he wanted this slavery to be against the law. I guess it's because there's an economic basis to slavery in that regard. He wanted to enjoy living a good life, but he couldn't enjoy a good life if he freed his slaves and his competitors didn't. So there's an economic basis to a lot of history. We got a national anthem because there was heightened patriotism during World War I. The soldiers who were in World War I came back. The Army and the Navy had adopted the Star-Spangled Banner as their official songs, let's say, in around 1895. So these American soldiers who came back would now be very familiar with it as an anthem. And the Veterans of Foreign Wars and other patriotic and veterans organizations began a campaign soon after the war ended in 1918, and it took them until 1931 to persuade Congress to adopt the Star-Spangled Banner as the national anthem. Until then, we did not have one. Yes, America the Beautiful, which still gets a lot of support today. A lot of people find it easier to sing. Sure, last 10, 15 years, I've written about congressmen who have introduced bills, and I went over my clips while I was working on this book, and I found something that I wrote in 1984 interviewing a congressman. And he said, "Mark my words, America the Beautiful will be the national anthem by the year 2000. Well, he's not in Congress anymore. We still have the same national anthem. Well, you know it's hard to sing. Everybody knows it's hard. The range is too great. It's about an octave and a half. The only people who can sing it without butchering it, switching octaves, are people with trained voices. I interviewed Robert Merrill of the Metropolitan Opera / New York Yankees for the book. He loves the song. He says he's inspired by it. He likes America the Beautiful too, but Robert Merrill would never want us to stop Star-Spangled Banner as our national anthem. Another Washington lawyer story. He had a great impact on that school. He helped save it from going out of business. He was an old boy and a grad, and it fell on hard times when he was in his maturity, I guess in the 1820s or thereabouts. It had received support from the state of Maryland, which then withdrew the support. And Key rallied the former grad, the ex-grads, the grads of St. John's to rally around and keep St. John's functioning. And as you know, it's today one of the finest small colleges in the United States. The flag did not have what I call an iconic status until the Civil War. Proof of that is people took pieces of the flag as souvenirs. They did not regard it as a sacred object. At the Smithsonian, they've made a verb out of souvenir. They say, people souvenired the flag. The man who was the commander of the fort, Major Armistead, took possession of the flag after the war. And evidently, people came up to him after the War of 1812 and said, could I have a piece of the flag? And he took a piece. The Flag Museum in Baltimore has 8 or 9 pieces of the flag that it has acquired over the years. And that's why it's not as big today as it was when it was made. It was a gigantic flag when it was made. It's still gigantic, but it's lost several feet. There was some flag, it had to be in California, right? It was, must be 10 times the size of this flag. In fact, it was in Washington 10 years ago or so. I must have been off that day because I didn't see it. But little tidbit that we threw in the book. It's in the, if anybody is really interested, the largest flag in the world can be found in the Guinness Book of World Records. Well, soon after my article appeared, this would have been in the spring of 1999, much of the research was done right here, right down the street at the Library of Congress. A lot of the research was done in Baltimore. Fort McHenry is marvelous. Anybody who is ever on a holiday in Baltimore, or somebody on a holiday in Washington and has to go north on I-95 to get, say, to Philadelphia or to New York, just stop off there for a couple of hours. It is so important to our history. And the people there, Scott Sheeds and Anna von Luntz, 2 of the park rangers that I spoke to, were just fantastic. They couldn't do more for me. They said, you want this? They copied this for me, records from the fort to go into the book. Then the other major source of information that I had, and we haven't gotten into this, was on the British side. I called a friend of mine, or sent an email to her in London, and I said, will you please do some research for me on Robert Ross? And she's a historian, and she said, the only Robert Ross I know is the good friend of Oscar Wilde. I said, no, not that Robert Ross. I said, it's Brigadier General Robert Ross. She said, well, I can't do it, but I've got a friend, John Mason. And John Mason went to the regimental records of the units that General Ross was with, and we got some really good stuff from there. And so that was another principal area. Ross, who we haven't gotten into, was the commander of the British land forces. He's the one who brought the troops into Washington so they could burn it. And he is the general who led them on the attack of Baltimore. The fleet dropped off their army units at a place called North Point, 15 miles below Baltimore, and the unit marched up to try to capture Baltimore. Very soon, a sniper shot General Ross and killed him. It led the Duke of Wellington to say that he questioned the wisdom of having his generals at the head of their troops. Ross was an inspiring leader. When he was here in Washington, he had his horse shot out from under him. He was very tough on horses. I found 3 other references to horses being shot out from under General Ross. He was a commander in the Peninsula campaigns against Napoleon, and he got shot a couple times, got hit in the chops, as he put it, in a letter to his wife. And he said that after the Battle of Baltimore, he was going to return to his wife and never go to war anymore. but a sniper got him. And it so depressed the British troops that someone wrote, a moan went up in the ranks, and they lost their will to fight. Who knows? If Ross had not been killed, I can't say that the war would have had another outcome. That's the what-if school of history, and I can't deal with that. But he was a marvelous character, and a person I never heard of until I started doing research on the book, and until my friend's colleague in London got the regimental records. It was my decision. It doesn't have as many words in it as I contracted for. And this was pointed out to me. And I said, I've said what I've had to say. I think if I did more, it would be padding. Can't we just end it here? And maybe I was persuasive, maybe I was stubborn, but we ended it where I ended it. I think it's a good story. In my new life as a sometimes freelance writer, I agreed to do a piece on the new visitor center at the Capitol for the magazine of the Pew Charitable Trusts. And they asked for an author's ID. And I wrote, I wanted to promote the book. I wrote that I was a former New York Times person, and then I've written this book. And I said it's a history of the Star Spangled Banner. And about a day later, it occurred to me, I don't want to call it a history, so I wrote back, email is wonderful. Sent back an email. I said, can you change that from a history to a story? And he had a good sense of humor. He wrote back, he said, you mean you want to be known as a storyteller and not as a historian? And I said, yes. So he said, fine. Oh, I don't know that I agreed that American historians set out to embellish American history. The story of the War of 1812 was hardly touched on when you and I were in school. So maybe it's natural that if it's hardly ever touched on, that some of the things that I think now are important were not mentioned, like the American attack on Toronto and the American attempt to conquer Canada. The Americans also burned what is now Niagara in Canada and several other places. So I never knew that, and I'm hoping that my, as you put it, my little book will inform some people of this unusual event. Well, it completely burned it. The difference between the American attack on Toronto and the British attack on Washington is that the British commander said, just burn public buildings. The American commander gave no such order. He said, burn the place. They burned the place. There was a lot of looting. The Americans broke into the city jail, let the people out, and they joined in the looting. Many private houses in Toronto were burned down, and none in Washington. I hope so. Yes, a couple of subjects. I would like very much to write a book about Italy with my wife, because I think if I have some writing ability and if I combine that with her knowledge of Italian food and Italian art, I think it could be quite a combination. We have to persuade a publisher that it would be a good book to publish, because there are more than one book on Tuscany on your local bookstore shelves today. Someday I'd like to do a book on my hometown of Camden, New Jersey, which I regret to say today is the worst city in the United States. And I would like to be able to say how it got that way. I don't know if I'll be able to say how it could be fixed. I don't know if I have the answers, but I could certainly say how it got to be in such a sorry state that it's in. Thank you for having me.